y'all, coming to you from Jacksonville, Florida. This is GovLove, a podcast about local government brought to you by engaging local government leaders. I'm Ben Kittelson, senior consultant at TELUS and GovLove co-host. We've got a great episode for you today. We're going to be talking parking and housing. But first, the best way to support GovLove is to become an ELGL member. Engaging Local Government Leaders is a professional association engaging the brightest minds in local government, and your membership helps support this podcast. So if you want to hear more episodes, go become a member today. Now, let me introduce today's guest. Catie Gould is a senior transportation researcher for Sightline Institute, specializing in parking policy. Her research and reporting have helped numerous jurisdictions reduce or repeal their parking mandates. She brings a decade of experience in engineering and data analysis to her work at Sightline. And prior to joining the organization, she also led Bike Loud PDX, advocating for better bike and bus infrastructure in Portland. And she also wrote about local transportation issues in that role. And so, Catie, welcome to GovLove. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks. Excited to be here.
Cool. And we have a tradition on the podcast to do a lightning round. I think it allows our guests to warm up a little bit and get to know you a little better. So my first question for you, what book are you currently reading?
I currently have 3 books that I am partially reading. Probably most relevant here, I'm halfway through Arbitrary Lines by Nolan Gray. It's all about zoning and the history of zoning. So I'm really enjoying that right now.
Yeah, that's a great one. Nolan came on the podcast to talk about that book. So definitely lots of lessons for local governments there too.
Oh yeah, I meet with him occasionally to talk about these issues. So it's always good to read someone's book.
Yeah. Awesome. And then my next lightning question for you. What was the first album that you bought?
I really struggle with questions like these, musically specifically. Music was not really a big part of my life growing up. My parents didn't really listen to a lot of music, and I, even just like going to school, I was super intimidated by like other people's knowledge of artists and albums and songs. Until recently, and I'm in a band now, but I have no idea what the first album, like maybe a CD, maybe like the Backstreet Boys when I was like, a preteen. I don't know. I still, if I go over to someone's house and they ask me to pick out a record or something, I'll make my choice based off of the art.
Nice.
What looks good.
I think that's a legit way to choose. My first one was also a boy band. My brother and I debate whether or not mine was the NSYNC one or the Backstreet Boys, but we both got one around the same time, so I can relate. All right, then next line of our question: what's the last thing, movie, TV show you watched?
Probably I'm watching the new episodes of Sex and the City. I've seen all the old ones. I don't like the new series as much, but I have to catch up every week. So
yeah, you gotta
that's my show right now.
I love it. All right, and then my last line question for you: where do you go for inspiration?
This is a tough question. I think I'm gonna have to go with reading the news. I think this really just appeals to my curious nature. I grew up, my parents subscribed to the daily paper, and it's something that, I was always reading over breakfast. And, the expression that truth is stranger than fiction.
Yeah.
There's so many fascinating, upsetting, just the world is this incredibly vast place. There's so many interesting things going on. And I love, just spending 15-20 minutes diving into this other topic and learning about something that I had no idea about. And I'm sure some people go outside to nature. I enjoy all those things too. It's relaxing, but maybe not inspiring and thought-provoking in the same way that I still love reading the news.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. I like that. All right, and then I always like asking how people got into the work that they do. So, as in your role in Sightline and doing some of this advocacy work, how did you end up doing this work? How'd you get into it?
It's been a really long path. I think if I had to start at the beginning, it would probably be when I moved to Portland, Oregon, right after I graduated college. And I bought a bicycle, right, for the first time in my adulthood. It'd been a long time since I'd ridden it, but there's a lot of people ride bikes around here. I was pretty broke at the time. I had a good job. I also had like $90,000 of student loans.
Yeah.
I was like trying to make friends and meet people. So I'd like bike to the bar on the weekend, or and someone told me about Pedalpalooza, this bike festival that happens in the summer, and I met a ton of my social network going on group rides. And it didn't like take very long for me. Like within 1 or 2 years, I had like started going to public meetings
Yeah.
about there's this new bike lane coming in my neighborhood, and I'm like, oh, I better go, because it doesn't take very much to kind of look around you at the streets and be like, why did they design it this way? This is so
Mm.
hard for me to use. I'm sure like one really thoughtful comment would like help make this project 10% better. And once you go to like a couple public meetings, you meet the other people who are also going to public
Yeah.
meetings.
Yeah.
And it was a real slippery slope from there of getting involved in public policy. So, yeah, I was a co-chair of Bike Loud for maybe 4 or 5 years, the all volunteer run bike advocacy organization. I was on the bicycle advisory committee for the city
Oh,
for a
wow.
number
Yeah.
of years as well. And just all around me, I felt like in this advocacy community, I felt like there were just scandals everywhere.
Oh, really?
Like they're going to do what?
Yeah.
Why
Yeah.
am I not reading about this on the news? And I kind of trained myself to be a reporter, started taking
Mm.
classes and going to conferences, and started doing that work. I guess like on the side, right? I had a full-time job. I was a mechanical engineer for HP, the printer company. I was designing office printers, which was really good and totally different
Yeah.
than
Yeah.
all of this. And just I was looking for the right job to make the move. I really wanted to do more writing and reporting, but working for newspapers, a lot of times you have to give up all of your political leanings, right?
Mm.
All of that
Mm.
advocacy work. So a think tank like Sightline was a really perfect fit for me, right? We are trying to shape policy outcomes with our work. So yeah, I was really happy landed there a couple years ago.
Yeah, no, and I've enjoyed kind of following. I think I came across your work on Twitter or something. I've enjoyed following your work, and one of the reasons I want to have you on was you've written a bunch of articles for Silent on kind of parking mandates, which
Yes,
is
it's my
the
beat.
coolest
It's
topic. Yeah,
Yeah, parking intersects with everything. And, when I was doing work on bike lanes and stuff, it comes up all the time, right?
yeah,
We're going to have to
hmm
remove 10 parking spaces to put in
yeah,
this new infrastructure. And it's always very politically charged. One of the first stories I wrote freelance was also about parking. It was like using parking funds to fund private security around homeless encampments. That was
mm,
like, yeah, one of the first. Anyway, so it's just, I keep coming back to parking
yeah,
over the years, kind of no matter what I do. And it's a great topic. And I'm going to be on it for years to come. That's for sure.
yeah. Well, and to your point, like it's interlocked with so many other policy issues like transportation and housing and that. So it's a good it's a good beat to be on. I think if you're interested in urbanism issues. Um, so anyway, so I kind of want to talk about some of the trends that you're seeing and some of the specific things that you've written about. But maybe as a starting point, can you talk about what is a parking mandate and what are some of these policy areas that you've been kind of monitoring and exploring?
Yeah. Even though a lot of us, right, anyone who drives needs a parking spot, and parking is all around us, very few people outside of kind of this professional niche know about parking mandates, or also we call them minimum parking requirements.
Hmm.
Um, but this is kind of how I describe it. It really took off in think through the 50s and 70s. Um, Kind of for a few decades, pretty much every city in North America adopted these rules, right, as part of larger kind of zoning packages um, that require pretty much every new building, every new
Hmm.
home, every new business to have a predetermined number of parking spaces. So, uh, for like a new single family home, maybe you need to have the city's requiring you to have two spaces, maybe two garage spaces, right? Or
Hmm.
they're enclosed. For a restaurant, those usually have really high parking requirements. They could require, maybe 8 per 1,000 square feet. Is pretty common that in some of these ratios, the city is requiring that the parking area essentially be larger than the business that it's serving,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And we talk about like why we love downtowns or what makes a walkable street, and like why the suburbs are kind of like boring and like icky and full of parking lots. Those things didn't happen on accident, right?
Mm-hmm.
These were written into the zoning codes. In a lot of places, you aren't able to build your beloved, buildings in your neighborhood anymore because they're non-compliant with the modern zoning code. So a lot of people are unaware that these
Yeah.
rules exist. And we're currently in this really exciting, I call it's like a once in a generation moment where, because of all these issues that have built up over the decades, like housing shortages, uh, cities and states are reforming these rules and restoring
Mm-hmm.
people's property rights to determine for themselves how much parking you need. And a lot of us we're kind of afraid, like, what if there isn't enough parking, right? We've
Yeah.
all had this experience where you're trying to go somewhere and the parking's full and it's really stressful and you're circling around the block. Maybe it's the street parking's full, maybe the parking lot's also full. I live right next to a Trader Joe's, like, and people complain about the parking there all the time. I get it. But the real problem with parking mandates, what's the right amount of parking for a restaurant to
Yeah.
have?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How many restaurants do you have in your city? 3,000? How can you
Yeah.
possibly come up with one ratio that meets everyone's needs without, some places having more parking than they'll ever use, and some places saying, well, this lot can't possibly support that many parking spaces
Mm-hmm.
because the building already exists, right? It only has 16 spaces. The code says I need 23. Now you can't open your business. It's not the city's position, I think, to get involved with these things. A lot of us would also prefer to have a dishwasher at our home. Does that mean we should make non-dishwasher homes illegal? No.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
If it's important to you, then you can, find a home that meets your needs. But different things are, have different levels of importance to different people. And parking is just one consideration when you're looking about like what home might work for you, or where's a suitable place to open up your business. So yeah, that's my 101 on parking mandates.
Yeah. Well, and I think the more I've learned about this topic, and I'm by no means an expert or uh, super knowledgeable, but those ratios and kind of the standards that cities set are often just kind of, and for lack of a better word, made up. Like,
They
right? Like
are.
they're
They're
not like
completely
based
made
on.
up.
Yeah.
They're not based on much. A lot of cities copy, right? They copied each other, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Here's a common ratio how to become like there's not a lot of science that went behind this. And even if you tried to use a lot of math to try to figure out what's the average, right? Like what's the
Mm-hmm.
average parking demand at hardware stores or something, you can't set a minimum ratio at an average, right? No matter
Yeah.
where you set this number, there are always going to be properties that are falling below that, and that are you're going to be snuffing out business and opportunities um, based on what based on this arbitrary ratio that the hope is that if there was only enough off-street parking, there would never be a parking problem. There would never be an on-street parking problem, right? There's enough
Yeah.
parking for everyone. We don't have to manage it. But that's just not, it's not how it works in real life, right? Whenever like
Yeah.
I'm with friends or something, we're trying to find a parking spot or a thing. If we're having a hard time finding an available street parking space, right, um, the only way that a city can ensure that there's available street parking is through permits and meters, right? Those
Yeah.
are those
Yeah.
are the tools in their toolbox. If you're willing to pay for a garage, there will be a space available for you,
Yeah.
right? But there is parking. There's an oversupply of parking in pretty much every city that's ever done a parking study.
Yes.
The
Yeah.
question is, how do we use parking efficiently, right? And
Mm-hmm.
just because there's parking available doesn't necessarily mean you can park in it, right? Can I park in the grocery store near my house when I'm not shopping there? Like technically, no. Right. So these kind of parking mandates, they kind of privatize the problem. They force these costs
Yeah.
onto all these individual buildings instead of maybe more, right? We've lost a lot of experience that cities could have had over the last few decades about more active street management.
Yeah.
So, and we've made all these other problems in the process.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, there's definitely parking in most American cities, but it may not be right in front of where you're trying to go, which is what when you hear complaints about people not finding parking in front of Trader Joe's, it's because it's not in that exact lot. But you could probably find parking a block over or 2 blocks over if they really wanted to.
Yeah, and in really big parking lots, nobody really wants to park on the edge either,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So,
So you mentioned, we're kind of in this moment and of like lots of, cities and states taking a look at these mandates and changing them. So maybe I don't, before we kind of get into the specifics, maybe at a high level, what are some of those trends that you're seeing? Is it just purely full repeal? Are there like some other strategies that places are taking that around kind of addressing some of the issues related to parking?
yeah, for a long time, parking reform was really stuck in downtown and city centers, right?
Hmm.
Purely for the reason that there's so many buildings that are already there that are non-compliant with the code, right? That if you require a change of use, right? Maybe you have this beautiful brick building from 1910, and it used to be um, an office, and now someone wants to open up a retail store, right? That change of use triggers a
Hmm.
land use review, and it might require more parking spots than that property already has. Maybe it has 0, maybe it has 5. It doesn't really matter, right? If it needs more parking, you're kind of stuck.
Yeah.
So a lot of places, um, I would say maybe even the majority, there's some, few blocks at least, maybe, like a square mile of the downtown has reduced or eliminated parking minimums, because that's such a difficult spot to apply minimums to after the fact.
Yeah.
Right, if
Yeah.
these codes were adopted in 1960 and you have all this building stock that's older than that, that makes sense. Um, so parking reform has kind of lived in those areas for a long time. And what we're seeing now, I would say really starting in 2017 with Hartford, Connecticut, and Buffalo, New York doing the full citywide repeal,
Hmm.
right? No parking is required anywhere in the city for any use. We are just deleting this part of our zoning code, right? It was a bigger zoning change that those cities did, but as a part
Hmm.
of it, there's no more parking requirements
Yeah.
or parking minimums at all. Um, and more cities have followed suit, right? Where we're not defending parking minimums on the edges of the city. Let's just have a simple, fair zoning code that treats everyone the same and gives everyone the same flexibility. Last year, I counted at least a dozen cities
Oh,
did that
wow.
same repeal. So it's a really growing movement. Um, so some really big cities like San Jose, California, right?
Yeah.
It's a really big population. Also, Anchorage, Alaska covers a ton of land area.
Yeah.
And
I
there's
mean,
a couple
Anchorage to
other,
Hartford doesn't get much further apart. Yeah.
yeah, geographically certainly. And there's a couple other things that are happening too, right? We're seeing some really exciting movement in state level reforms. So
Yeah.
also last year in 2022, California adopted AB 2097 that
Hmm.
eliminated parking mandates within a half mile of frequent transit stations. Really huge success for California. That's really, really exciting. Um, and there, hold on, I'm finding my notes. There was a federal bill introduced
Yeah.
just earlier this spring, right, modeled off of what California did. Um, but it's not just in California. Last year it was a very different route, but Oregon also adopted a statewide
Mm.
parking reform as a part of an administrative rulemaking process
Yeah.
that involves a lot of transportation and land use planning rules. Um, and the reform, I would say, went a bit farther than California. It applies to the metro areas, but it has a similar provision of no parking mandates may apply within a half mile of frequent transit corridors.
Yeah.
It's a larger radius around train stations, but also for a ton of other categories like small residential units, affordable housing. It's a long list of categories, and it's forcing cities in Oregon in this additional step to eliminate their mandates completely or adopt a lot of other parking management. Um, so we're
Strategies.
seeing a lot of
Yeah.
a lot of cities are going that route. So that's two states that are doing had totally different pathways and are going to see some different outcomes, but it's really exciting. A lot of other states
Yeah.
have introduced similar legislation.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so that's kind of the moment that we're in right now. So both California and Oregon, those new rules only went into effect this past January. So we're in the first year of
Yeah.
this.
Yeah. That's so cool. Well, and again, talk about places that are so different. Like, were there any, or when as you were kind of learning about these reforms in different places, like, are there any examples? I don't know. You mentioned Anchorage, like about how those reforms came about, like how that happened. Because obviously, like some of these cities, there's not a lot in common other than having done this action. So, is there any kind of lessons you could draw from like what was or how these reforms came about?
Oh yeah, Anchorage is an incredible story actually, and I find it really inspiring. A lot of planning departments know that parking minimums are a problem, right? They're the people on the front lines, right, from the city side who
Hmm.
are getting people, right, developers coming to them saying, "Can I do this project? What do I need to do?" And they're the ones who are in the unfortunate position of saying, "No, sorry, you don't have enough parking," right? Or someone complains about their neighbor's property and say, "I don't think they're code compliant," and they have to like follow up and say, "Well, sorry, you're not code compliant. We're going
Yeah.
to have to issue these fines, or you're going to have to do a parking study to prove to us that you don't need these spots." Um, so I'd say lots of planning departments in the United States for sure know that this is a problem. They're the ones that are granting um, right reductions. A lot of zoning codes have administrative reductions that staff can do if X, Y, Z is met. So the city of Anchorage was working on maybe for about 2 years um, some reductions in the parking requirements for some areas that they thought were particularly troublesome.
Hmm.
Um, it was not a very exciting reform. Frankly, it's nothing that I would have written about, right? It wasn't like it wasn't
Yeah.
exciting enough. The geographic scope was very limited, and it was not like a wholesale elimination. It was a percent reduction, right? That's kind of where, and I really feel for city staff. I have so many friends that are on city staffs and
Hmm.
work for transportation or planning departments, and they get yelled at public meetings so much.
Yeah. About parking.
their
Yeah.
their job is really hard. A lot of times this is how the public interfaces with the city, is these kind
Hmm.
of meetings and stuff, and that's kind of where they judge the politics we're at, right? This is
Hmm.
this is what's defensible. We can probably get this done. A reform needs to get done. um, but throughout this process, right, there was just this incredible, really like small group of people, 10, 12 people, kind of started talking to each other at the right time. There were a few, it's called the Assembly, the city
Hmm.
council in Anchorage, newly elected assembly members um, who got interested in this topic, right? And what kind of happened was, well, if we're going to spend all this time talking about parking requirements and like reducing them, why don't we just use this opportunity to get rid of them all? Right?
Hmm.
In Anchorage,
Yeah.
there's this, they've been losing population for a couple years. It's a very difficult place to build, right? They have a
Mm.
short construction season. Supplies are expensive. Labor costs are very expensive. And it's hard to build stuff. There's not a lot of new stuff that's getting built every year. And um, kind of almost everyone I talked to up there, agreed, yeah, we should make it easier for people to build stuff. It should be
Yeah.
easier to build more housing. It should be easier for people to open a business here. Um, 'Cause they really want to encourage people to build roots in their community and not like lose their young people to the lower 48 for better job opportunities.
Hmm.
And once kind of people agree that that's the problem and that making it easier to build stuff is the solution, um, it had just a ton of political support to just say we're going to get rid of
Yeah.
all the rid of all
Yeah.
the parking minimums, and we trust that business owners are going to do what's best for them and their customers. Um, a couple of the co-sponsors of that ordinance own businesses downtown where there already weren't parking minimums, and that was like a shock to people. Because downtown Anchorage is full of parking lots,
Hmm.
right? Walking around that city, nobody can really say that there's not enough parking.
Yeah.
Parking issues are super local, maybe block to block. Um, Maybe like this one particular, really, the most popular restaurant in the city is hard to find parking there sometimes.
Yeah.
Um, but everywhere else is like, well, gosh, a lot of the city's paved over, and it really doesn't need to be. Why are we requiring more parking. We think people are able to just judge for themselves. So they eliminated parking requirements. I want to say it was right before Thanksgiving last year. So huge congrats to them.
Yeah, that's
And I think,
cool.
yeah,
Yeah,
a lot of cities are having this
yeah,
conversation, right? And I think it's inspiring for people, if you're on the advocacy side or sorry, the city staff, right? If we're talking about it at all, why not ask the question?
yeah,
What are,
yeah,
why not? Why not go all the way and just get rid of these rules? Wouldn't that make the zoning code shorter? Wouldn't that be easier for people to understand rather than adding more overlay zones or more exceptions? Right? You shouldn't have to, hire a land use lawyer to figure out what you can do on your own property.
yeah, yeah.
Especially if you want to support small businesses and local
Hmm.
entrepreneurs and people who already live in your community, who aren't steeped in this stuff. Um, it's just is great to see what happened up there, and is probably the most popular tweet I've written of all time.
Yeah.
Right, this got adopted at like almost midnight Pacific time, and it just spread like wildfire. Right, even Anchorage. Um,
Yeah.
so
No, that's awesome. Well, and to your point, like it can have this impact on making development cheaper and making housing cheaper. And I think one of the articles that you wrote that I really enjoyed to get at some of that impact was you kind of compared, Seattle and Buffalo both did. I think it was repealing parking mandates, and I think some other land use reforms too, right? And so, what I guess I want to talk about that comparison you made, but why were those two cities in particular maybe interesting for this topic? Because anyway, I won't spoil it, but I want you to explain why.
yeah, both of these cities. So Seattle is not a citywide repeal, but they did repeal parking mandates for a significant portion of the city because of its transit adjacency. What's interesting about these two places is one, they both had academic studies about what changed after the
Yeah.
zoning change, right? That's
Mhm.
really
Yeah.
important. I'm excited for all the future studies coming out of all these cities that are doing their policy changes today to see how other cities kind of fit into these results. Um, but what was interesting, right? So both of these studies, they looked at, great, well, now that builders have the flexibility to build as little parking as they want, what ends up happening?
Hmm.
Um, and both of them, fewer parking spaces were built than what
Yeah.
would have been required by the code before. Um, and that's great. But I really care about housing, right? We're
Yeah.
in housing
Yeah.
shortages. How does parking minimums influence um, housing? We know that the more parking you require, the less space you have for building. Anyway, so we went back to these researchers and we asked a different question
Yeah.
of how many new homes ended up utilizing the new flexibility in the code and built a little less, right? Because their building built a little less parking than was
Hmm.
required before. And the answer for both of them was the majority, right? And
Yeah.
these studies, they were really about multifamily, larger buildings, right? This isn't like new single family homes or even duplexes, right? Their data set was kind of confined in this way. But Buffalo study, right, it was like 36 new buildings. In Seattle, it was like almost 900, right? But they got
Hmm.
almost the same result. Where in Seattle, I think is 59% of the new homes in this study created ended up using that code flexibility, and Buffalo is 68%.
Wow.
And these are really different. These are really different cities. Buffalo's
Really
had a
different
declining,
markets. Yeah. Yeah.
yes, really different market. They have a really, really old housing stock, right? A lot of their buildings are like pre-World War II, right? Buffalo
Hmm.
was a much bigger city than it is today. Seattle, by comparison, has been going through this huge population growth, right? A lot of the
Hmm.
buildings are new. And, right, I think it was like in 2012 where this reform came in,
Yeah.
right, in the midst of this building boom. So the fact that most of these new homes benefited from the reform, I think is really encouraging. It's really hard to say, right, were more homes built because this one reform is very difficult. I talk to a lot of people, and I think the answer is this impossible to say.
Yeah. It's like
There's so
probably,
many.
but also
There's
maybe they get a variance, so maybe not all. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, it's hard to tell, like the before and after. The variance processes are such a barrier in
Yeah.
itself, right? They're
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
discretionary, they cost extra money, it takes extra time. A lot of people are not even interested in going through a variance process. They'll walk away from a project but way before that happens.
Mhm.
So it's hard to compare like a before and after. And also there's so many other factors that affect the construction industry, right? What are interest rates? What's going on with the city? There's other, zoning regulations, different fees that the city might assess one year versus another. So it's really hard to tie an increase in construction activity to a parking reform specifically. But
Mhm.
the fact that, right, like 60-70% of those new homes benefited meant that, right, they were able to be built at lower cost
Yep.
because they were able to build less parking than the city would have required. And in some cases, right, these projects might have not gotten off the ground at all.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and to your point, that they worked in two very different housing markets too, or just say that developers took advantage of those, that barrier or that flexibility in two different markets shows that it could probably work in any community if it can work that way in Seattle and Buffalo. I would argue, but
Yes, builders definitely will use the flexibility.
yeah,
That's for sure. And right, one common fear about like, well, what if you lift parking requirements, then no, developers are
does
going to
parking get
they're going to
built? Yeah,
pocket
yeah,
all the money. They're not going to
yeah,
build
yeah,
any parking, and then nobody's going to be able to find a home with a parking spot anymore. That also like wasn't the case. The vast majority of these new buildings that were included in these studies still built parking. Right? I
yeah,
think in Buffalo, 83% of these buildings in the study still built parking. In Seattle, 70%, right? And if you think Seattle's kind of the, right, maybe the extreme end, super tight housing market, things
hmm
are expensive. There's also like really, really great transit, and it's getting
hmm
better every year. Um, in Seattle, right, 70% of the buildings still included parking, just a different amount of parking
yeah,
than what the city had required before, right? So your city is probably going to fall somewhere on that spectrum where like
yeah,
probably somewhere between 70 and 100%, or 90% of your buildings are still going to include parking.
yeah.
It's really the kind of the corner case, the special unit. Some people don't require parking, or it's not important to them. Um, but it's not common, right, that a ton of buildings are going to get built without parking after, right, even if they have the flexibility to do so.
Yeah, it's the same, I think, conversation you have around the repealing of like single family zoning, right? It's not you're getting rid of the ability to build parking or build this kind of housing. It's you're now giving folks the flexibility to build, whatever they want rather than what the local government thinks you should. Yeah.
Yeah, I like making that parallel a lot, actually. Um, in kind of the world of housing reform and trying to re-legalize these housing options that used
Yeah.
to be common and
hmm
traditionally built, like duplexes or sixplexes, um, we think parking is taking a very similar course, right?
hmm
We're doing a statewide policy reform or just a citywide repeal. Maybe it was unthinkable 10 years ago,
Yeah.
but now it seems a lot more common sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Well, you mentioned Oregon at the beginning of our conversation and some of the state level action that's been done. How has since you're in Oregon and how has kind of the repeal of some of those parking mandates impacted housing and kind of throughout the state?
Yeah, well, it's too early to have any like real numbers,
Yeah,
but we're gathering a bunch of stories,
yeah,
right,
yeah,
about housing projects that are happening. So I guess I have a few examples here for you.
hmm
One, I talked to this architect, Gene Templeton. He was planning just a small apartment building um, in Beaverton. It was pretty close to light rail.
yeah,
It's kind of in their downtown area. The lot had a very small house that was in really bad shape, right? Which was like a really prime property to be converted into more housing units.
hmm
And before the reform was implemented, he was planning on a building that would have 9 apartments and the 7 required parking spaces that the city required there. Um, and he was having a really difficult time
Hmm.
doing the building. Part of the reason, and this is pretty, I think is pretty common in these codes as well, where the parking was required to be behind the building.
Hmm.
That makes for a really nice streetscape environment, right? For like a place that wants to be walkable, of like, it's not cars separating the building from the sidewalk, but the cars are kind of hidden behind. But what that essentially meant is that he had to punch out this hole through the building, and most of the first floor was like being held up on stilts, right?
Hmm.
Of like concrete and steel supports, um, to get the cars through
Back
the
there.
building, right?
Yeah.
And then like this huge parking lot that was like covering like half the back half of the property.
Mm.
So when he heard about, right after these rules were adopted, he went to work redesigning the building. He took out all the parking, right? So this is a no parking building now. And he was able to add 4 more units to the
Yeah.
building. So now it has 13 homes. And it's just a much simpler construction project. It's a simple wood frame building.
Mm.
So that's right, a project that benefited, that even though they had the parking before and he wasn't going to ask for a variance, right? We can kind of see how it's possible to add more housing if you don't have to save the space for
Mm.
parking.
Yeah.
It was also able um, to mix up the unit sizes, right? So
Yeah.
before, where he had a mix of studio, 1 bedroom, and 2 bedroom apartments. Now that you had this more flexibility, so that was like a really exciting project to hear about. Um,
Well, and the
Another one,
construction cost there is so fascinating. Where
uh huh,
yeah, you can do wood frame, which I imagine is cheaper and all that. So that's really interesting. Yeah. Sorry,
yeah.
you do your other. Yeah.
Another project that we've been following for a while is this affordable housing development in Troutdale, Oregon.
Mm.
Home Forward is the developer on it, and they anyways told us a story that was like, what, I can't believe this is happening.
Yeah.
But so right, so this is using like taxpayer funded money. The city has a shortage of affordable housing. They're trying to build affordable housing. The city had incredibly high parking requirements, 2 parking spaces per unit.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. I would say a lot of places are implementing caps of 1 per unit, which is pretty, if you have to draw the line somewhere, that's a pretty reasonable line. Like 40% about of households in the US own 1 car or less, right? It's a pretty small percentage of car-free households. But there are like certain demographics of the population that are more likely to not have
Hmm.
a car, right? If you're low
Hmm.
income, or senior citizen, um, right? Then kind of like the typical average. Um, so this developer, they submitted studies to the city in the process of asking for a variance from this 2 space per unit, where they looked at, hey, we're measuring 5 other affordable housing developments, right, that are very similar, that are in this region, and how
Mm.
many cars are actually parked there, right? Here's the actual parking demand that we're finding. And they, through their research, found that the average parking demand at these 5 other buildings was like 1.1 parking
Mm.
spaces per unit,
Hmm.
right? So they're saying, hey, we think that, you know a lot of these parking spaces are not going to get used, the ones that
Yeah.
you're requiring. Maybe we can like compromise in the middle. What if we are like 1.3, 1.4 parking spaces per unit? Is that okay with you? And the city said no. They denied
Really?
their variance. And essentially, right, the position that they're putting this building through is like, the only way to meet the parking requirements is to you have to cut 24 affordable homes out of this project so
Wow.
that the
Yeah.
number of homes matches the space that's
Yeah.
available for a parking lot. Um, and this process was happening even after the state had adopted these reforms. This city is one of the 14 jurisdictions that sued the state over these rules, and
Mm.
that's still pending. But this project in particular was like cited in one of the motions,
Oh wow.
um, right, where they are, people are very concerned that now there's, right, the city is no longer able to require sufficient on-site parking. there's a police station on that street. Response times will suffer because the roads will be congested, because the parking problem in the city is just going to get worse. And it really gets back to like, who decides what is sufficient parking,
Yeah.
right? I would say, Home Forward, they did all their homework
Yeah.
here in trying to figure out how many parking spaces their future tenants would need. And what did the city do? Where did this two parking spaces per unit come from? I Nobody, as far as
Yeah.
I know, nobody is able to answer that question. So anyway, so that project also refiled for their permits when those rules went into effect in January. So those are just a couple of the changes that we're seeing happening now that people have this flexibility.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating how that can have such a big impact on the development and the number of units that can get built. That's awesome. Are there other trends kind of in you mentioned, obviously Oregon has tackled this in California. Are there other trends in other states and kind of how they're challenging parking mandates at the state level? Because that is fascinating to see kind of the state go in and say, you guys just aren't doing this right. So
Well, with a lot of housing issues, right, and zoning relating to housing issues, we're seeing a lot of states doing right kind of YIMBY or pro housing bills
yeah.
to legalize ADUs, to legalize middle housing, right, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and parking is often part of those bills. It's commonly part of those bills
Mm-hmm.
because, if your city, okay, now the state is saying you have to allow ADUs. If a city really doesn't want ADUs, they say, great, well, sure, you can do that, but we're going to require a off-street parking space for that ADU. And also, if you convert your garage, you're going to have to replace that spot, right? There's all these
Yeah.
barriers that cities can throw up
Mm-hmm.
still to block that type of housing if they want their community to stay, physically the same, even as it's getting, more expensive over the years.
Mm-hmm.
So parking reform is often included in that of saying um, cities can't require parking for ADUs, or cities can't require parking for triplexes if they're within this proximity to transit. So that's kind of the most common way that we're seeing parking reform happen in these bills. But there are other states that have begun to kind of address parking mandates on their own, right? As not as a part of a larger zoning package, but just to say, hey, we know this is one barrier and it's an easy barrier to get rid of, right? Where we can
Mm-hmm.
help encourage more housing, we can help small businesses, and it actually costs the city nothing
Yeah.
to get rid of this requirement, because it's very likely that the requirement is higher than what the market demands.
Yeah.
So Washington is one of those states last year that introduced kind of a standalone parking bill, very short, very closely modeled after California's. But some other states did as well, like Oklahoma.
Yeah.
So I think, and we put together that article this year because because I wanted to have a good record 5 years from now, right, of
Mm-hmm.
how this movement has grown, because I expect that list is going to get bigger every year.
Yeah. Well, I think what's fascinating is you're seeing obviously on the West Coast where they're dealing with like huge housing costs and a shortage of housing kind of in each of those states we've talked about. But then it's also happening in places like Oklahoma, and I think you also did an article in Montana, which are
Mm-hmm.
you know much different politically and dealing with similar and tackling these issues in a similar manner. So I know we could get into maybe some of the what's going on in Montana, but I'm curious, like, I'm curious of like what you saw there, and then like what the political environment is, or how this is getting approached in maybe an environment where the politics are way different than they are on some of those West Coast states.
Yeah, parking reform, and I would say a lot of zoning reform in general, it really cuts across traditional political boundaries,
Yeah.
right? For people on the left who really care about climate, about reducing driving, about affordable low income housing, zoning reform is necessary to get there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And on the other side of the spectrum, if you really care about individual property rights and the
Yeah.
government not telling you what to do and what you're allowed to do in your own garage, this is like a fun party trick. Maybe when you're with your family over the holidays, look up the development codes where people live and like find out what they're not allowed to do in their own garage, right? A ton
Yeah.
of people don't park in their garage, but their garage is required to have space available. You're supposed to park your car in the garage, right? That's like written
Yeah.
into the zoning code. Um, so there's like tons of people are living illegally, and they have no idea that these rules exist, right? Because they're rarely enforced. But it makes this really interesting coalition of people that kind of,
Hmm.
no matter what you agree or disagree on, this is something that can really bring people together and say this makes sense. So in Montana, especially, there was this like narrative of like we adopted California style zoning and we're gonna have California style problems unless we change this. And I think it
That's
was great.
fascinating.
It was incredible messaging that was
Yeah,
very
that's great.
popular there. A couple things are really interesting about Montana, right? It's Republican, across the board, right? This is very different than Oregon, where you think all
Hmm.
these rules they're being introduced by a bunch of Democrats. Montana is the opposite. They also legalized ADUs. They legalized duplexes. They legalized multifamily and housing in commercial areas, right?
Mm.
Let people live close to where they work, where the businesses are.
Yeah.
Why are we banning this, right? They also have a housing crisis. Um,
Yeah.
that was supercharged by the pandemic, right? Tons of
Hmm.
people working remotely and would love to work from the picturesque Montana, where there isn't a lot of suburban sprawl yet, right?
Yeah.
There's like, here's their cities, and then there's the country. And people really love and value the outdoors and nature there and want to see it preserved. Also, their state legislature only meets every other year. So when
Yeah.
you have a housing crisis that feels like it's really rapidly escalating, there was a lot of pressure um, that was, ended up being really positive. They passed a lot of things this year.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I think there was a line you had in there. It was like, our city should be able to build like there's a boom when there's a population boom, like meet the demand of folks that want to move here. And it's kind of interesting, like historically, like a lot of these Western cities, that's what happened. There was a big boom, and that's why you have a Billings, Montana, right? So you're just almost keeping with tradition in that way, where you want to have that flexibility to kind of meet the population demands that some of these places are seeing.
Oh yeah, definitely. I talk about this all the time. Zoning codes are updated way less often
Yeah.
than our real lives, right?
Hmm.
Think about even for just a brick and mortar retail store now versus 10 years ago, right? There's been this huge move to online shopping. Even like grocery stores or Walmarts, there's more people that are ordering their things ahead of time and then they're just picking them up,
Yeah.
right? They're not spending an hour in the store, they're spending 10 minutes in the store, right? Your
Hmm.
parking needs change. Stores don't need as much parking as they did before all that happened. And there's, likely nobody at the planning office
Yeah.
watching the online shopping trends and saying like, we better update our zoning codes
Yeah.
for this, right? It's more like, you just want a fertile garden bed so that like whatever changes happen can grow.
Mm. Ooh, I like that. Well said.
Yeah, if you set the stage so that your city can be flexible, then it can grow and change and be resilient,
Yeah.
right? As changes are needed. Something I think a lot about in the future, there's going to be a lot of migration,
Mm.
right?
Hmm.
Within the country, outside of countries, as places become harder to live with climate change.
Hmm.
And are we getting ready for that? Or are cities able to, you know, accommodate people moving here without it
Mm.
causing a housing crisis? Um, if we keep going the way that things have been for the last 30, 40 years, no, right?
Yeah.
Our cities used to be more flexible and more easily changed at the turn of the century than now. So we're kind of getting this, we're trying to undo some of these laws that have been
Yeah.
so problematic and really stifled so much innovation and growth.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. And I love the linking of that flexibility with resilience. That's a really good point. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of people are asking, what can we do for commercial office buildings? Right?
Hmm.
Commercial
Yeah.
office buildings are They're falling vacant. People are really concerned about downtowns. Well, if you had a really flexible zoning code, where it's already able to become housing, where you already don't require parking, that's a lot easier than this city that has those restrictions,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Hartford, Connecticut has been converting abandoned vacant office buildings into housing, for 10 years.
Yeah.
The state put in money to do that sort of a program. They're building thousands of residences in their downtown again and having people live downtown. And the zoning code certainly helped them do that, right? That reform. Um, that was 10 years ago. That wasn't a COVID related response. So this is something that all cities could do, and it'll just help them become more flexible for the future, because nobody knows exactly what's
Yeah.
happening next or what the future needs might be.
Yeah. Yeah. No, well said. Well said. Well, and that's a good place to kind of start to wrap us up. So I'm curious, what's next? What are you working on now that our listeners should look out for?
Oh yeah, well, I'm very lucky and proud to be living in Oregon, so I am definitely planning to continue to report what's happening here.
Mm-hmm.
We have about, I don't know, there's gonna be 40, 50 cities that are gonna be without parking requirements over the next
Mm-hmm.
1 to 2 years. A bunch of cities got extensions on the deadlines, that's fine. But that's really exciting, especially for smaller, more suburban cities. So much of this, people think this is a big city reform, right? You can only eliminate your parking minimums if your city has really good transit, if people can get around other ways. But it's not really the case.
Yeah.
We're talking about 16 spaces instead of 23. Nobody has to stop driving for this reform to be beneficial, even if the same number of parking spots were built after the reform as before. If the permitting process gets 1 month shorter, that is still a net benefit to your community.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Yeah.
I'm really excited to see what's going to happen, especially in these smaller cities. I'm hoping we can get some people studying this, because I'm just really excited to hear more about the changes that this is unlocking, because I think we don't really know, right? How much will this impact housing production? Is there a way that we can find out? I hope some smart academic researcher is going to be diving into this. But a lot of my work is now refocused on Washington State, right? They're my next door neighbors. There's some legislators there that are very excited to have these benefits in their communities too, right? Parking mandates is kind of a collective action problem, along with all those housing barriers, right? Where if one city does it, it's a little bit helpful, but it's not as helpful as if we reform 50
You do it all
cities at
together.
once.
Yeah.
Do it all together, right? That's a way that you can, that's the only way you're going to get out of a state housing crisis. It's going to take too long to go city by city. But there are some cities in Washington that are doing some parking reforms right now. Spokane just adopted a pilot project that exempted most of the city from parking mandates for the next year. There's other cities that I hear parking reforms they're underway. So I'm really excited to hear what's happening there and try to help support them with some research. So I guess, if there's any planners, government officials in Washington listening to this right now, please get in touch with me.
Yeah. Awesome.
I would love to talk to you and hear from you.
Perfect. That's great. Yeah. So reach out. That's great. So our traditional last question on GovLove is, if you could be the GovLove DJ, what song would you pick as the exit music for this episode?
Okay, I'm going to go with Lovely Day by Bill Withers. It's been one of my personal favorite songs this summer that I've been listening to on repeat. And I also think it just really captures the joy of this movement. It's very exciting time. It's a lot to be happy about. So
Awesome. Well, yeah, good pick. We'll get that queued up. And with that ends our episode for today. Catie, thank you so much for coming on and talking with me about your work and sharing all your expertise and everything you've learned. So I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you so much. This was really fun.
Yeah. And for our listeners, GovLove is brought to you by engaging local government leaders. And the best way to support GovLove is to become an ELGL member. You can reach us online at elgl.org/GovLove or on Twitter at the handle @GovLovePodcast. And you can subscribe to GovLove on your favorite podcast app. And if you're already subscribed, go share this podcast with a friend, a colleague, your neighbor, Help us spread the word that GovLove is the go-to place for local government stories. And with that, thank you for listening. This has been GovLove, a podcast about local government.
The day that lies ahead of me seems impossible to face, when someone else instead of me always seems to know the way. Then I look at you and the world's all right with me. Just one look at you and I know it's gone.